Welcome to our mini lecture on translation procedures and strategies. Our learning objectives for the lesson will be as follows. Students will be able to differentiate between translation strategy and translation procedure, describe the basic translation procedures, identify translation procedures in short translative segments, and finally recognize the advantages of using translation terminology to describe and defend the translation output. Let's discuss the difference between strategy and technique or procedure. Stop the recording and looking at these images as examples of strategy on the left, the blackboard there with the coach delineating different plays and so on. And on the right, we have a soccer player with the shooting stance and several labels for different skills or constituting what it required to shoot successfully in soccer. So stop the recording for 1 second and try to jot down some ideas as to what you think the strategy, intuitively, what the differences are between a strategy and a technique, a strategy and a procedure. Yes, you probably came up with the description of a strategy as a larger macro approach to a certain task, in this case a game, which includes several tactics or several different plays. Whereas on the right we see one of the different skills that needs to be mastered by the players of the game, which includes several different techniques or different approaches. So on the one hand we have a strategy that would be more an overall approach to face a certain task, whereas a skill, a technique, a procedure, a method would be a certain component of the whole game, and the style and the abilities needed to successfully play the game. So it would be a more micro or detailed notion. So in translation, we also see this scholars have established or have differentiated between strategies and procedures. The terminology tends to be a little bit vague, as we will see, but on the one hand, to simplify the terminology used, we'll look at strategies on the one hand and procedures on the other, although you would see that in different sources terms like method, methodology have been used, or technique, for instance, have been used as synonyms of procedures in translation. When we talk about the strategy, I'm quoting Jeremy Monday here and his very good definition when he defines strategy as an overall orientation of the translator. For example, the traditional distinction between free and literal translation. How the translator approaches the overall task of rendering the message of the target or the source text into the production of a new text of the target text. So we have an overall orientation. Whereas procedure, and again we are following Jeremy Monday from Leeds University in the definition, would be a specific technique or method used by the translator at a certain point in the text or in a text. For example, a translator may decide to borrow a word from the source language, or maybe he or she may decide to add an explanation or a footnote in the target text. So procedures would have to do with the task of skills, procedures, methods, techniques applied by the translator to solve a specific problem in the translation task. So as we've already explained, there's some vague use of terminology here, and some confusion. In some sources we see procedures, methods, techniques, whereas we'll see methodologies for strategy. So in this case, we'll be using strategy as the overall approach a translator takes for the translation of a certain source text, and procedures or as techniques that are applied within the overall process. Amparo Talabiri in 2001 defined techniques as specific verbal procedures which are visible in the translation results used to obtain translation equivalence. So we also see Chesterman in 2016 following Lercher's definition of strategy. Thus, Lercher's definition of a translation strategy takes explicit account of this. Quote, "A translation strategy is a potentially conscious procedure for the solution of a problem which an individual is faced with when translating a text segment from one language into another." So as you can see, Chesterman and Lercher use or look at the word strategy as also meaning micro approach to a translation segment. And they also use the word procedure, note conscious procedure, as a synonym of strategy. So to clarify, we will look at strategies as the macro approach, and we will look at procedures as the technique used to solve a certain specific, discrete translation problem, which is guided by the strategy of the overall approach. Examples of translation strategies taken from Amparo Talabir's 2001 Handbook on Translation Studies would be the following, just as examples. Obviously, historically, we see the terms literal and free translation as translation strategies, and or as opposing extremes or poles in a certain continuum, and the translator choosing between the free extreme and the literal extreme and different points in between. A literal translation would be a translation intuitively or traditionally that is really close to the source text, both in style, form, and meaning, whereas we find that a free translation will be just that, would include show examples of departures from the meaning or the form of the source language, or the source text rather, in the creation of a target text that resembles the source text more vaguely. These are traditional understandings of free and literal. In this case, we are going to be using literal and free according to Amparo Talabir's and Christiane Nord's proposals, just to show examples of potential translation strategies. But as you can see, as you will see here, we need to remember that literal and free in this slide and the next 4 slides have a specific meaning that is a little bit nuanced compared to those traditional meanings I have just explained. So on the one hand, we have communicative interpretative, we have literal, we have free, and then we have annotated translation as examples of translation strategies. The center, literal and free, would be the extremes, so to speak. And the far left and far right options would be places in between these strategies. If we look at the communicative interpretative first, we will see that we normally use this or apply this strategy, even if it's unbeknownst to us in general practice in the translation industry and in a typical translation training environment. The aims of this method or strategy are 3. First of all, to arrive at an accurate comprehension of the meaning found in the source text or the source text as such. Second, a reformulation of the source text meaning. And finally, a recreation of the source text effect in the source text that it had in the source text readers with the target text recipients. In other words, what we try to do with the communicative interpretative strategy, which is Amparo Talabir, I feel, describes influenced by the interpreting interpretative method of translation inherited by her teacher Danica Seleskovic, the famous interpreter and interpreter trainer, is first of all we understand the source text meaning accurately, then we reformulate the source text meaning in our target text, and finally we try to recreate the effect that the source text had in its original readers, and we try to recreate that with the target text recipients. As we can see, we're still missing something. We're missing a point here with this strategy, because these strategies, remember the picture, the image of the golf club bag. We have several tools available to us, both from a strategic point of view and from a methodological or procedural point of view. And these are neutral. They're obviously not neutral, but they can be used in different situations. We are not prescribing, and this is important to note, we are not prescribing in this presentation how we should translate, which method we should use, which procedures we should use, or which strategies we should use. The approach here is to look at examples of strategies and then look at a catalog, the most popular catalog or list or classification of translation methods or procedures. In a given translation process, we should have a framework, a functional framework that would dictate which strategy we should approach or we should adopt. And then, according to the choice of strategy, remember the sequence of events that we have mentioned at several points in the course, we should analyze the source text, and then we should, with the information that we should have a scopus and a translation brief to add to our analysis of the source text. With this information, then we can choose a strategy or a macro approach to the translation task, and then, during the translation process, as we identify problems of translation in the source text, and as we generate potential alternative solutions, and finally come to a conclusion as to which one we are going to choose as a solution to a given translation problem, in doing this, we would be implementing different translation procedures. And these procedures should be congruent with the analysis information and with our strategy. So, just to come back to the communicative interpretative strategy, in this case, the source text function and the textual genre are normally preserved in the target text. Okay? This description by Amparo Hurtado Albir is not taking into account the existence of a scopus and is not mentioning a translation brief or a source text analysis. This proposal was made separate from this theory. So these functional theories should be put aside for a moment as we see these proposals of strategies. So we try to preserve both the function and the textual genre. So if we are translating, according to this strategy, we are translating a contract or an agreement. The function of this would be to be binding upon the sources. It would be upon the parties involved. It would be an informative text, functionally speaking. And we would have to create if we were to apply or implement a communicative interpretative strategy, we would attempt to recreate this function, and our target text would be an informative target text or referential target text, and the textual genre would be preserved. We would have a legal text, an agreement or a contract in language 2 or the B language of the A language. So in this case, we're preserving the function and the genre. Examples of typical texts in which the communicative interpretative strategy could be applied would be user instructions or instruction manuals, technical documentation like directed technical documentation as such, in which we are obviously aiming at producing user instructions that can be used by the target readers in the same way that the source language readers use the source language text or the source text to follow those instructions and to use a certain appliance or a device. So this is the communicative interpretative. As you can see, this is a typical I would say that this most translators and translation service providers implement this strategy when dealing with the various textual genres that translation agencies and freelance translators and translation companies deal with on a daily basis for their customers. Literal translation. Again, remember we are talking about a proposal for a certain procedure of translation that has been named or tagged as literal by Amparo Hurtado-Albir. This method concerns itself mainly, Amparo Hurtado-Albir reminds us, with the reorganization or restructuring of the target text or source text linguistic features. This reorganization or restructuring of source text linguistic features in the target text is achieved through word for word, syntagma for syntagma, or sentence for sentence translation of the source text morphosyntactic features of the source text. So what you see here is a very close translation that formally adheres to the structure of this and word order of the source text, and even goes into the morphological level, that's the structure of words in the source text. We normally don't do this in translation, and these translations would not be accepted by customers. They would be construed as Spanglish. For instance, if we were to produce a literal translation according to this model of a strategic model, this strategy, the resulting text would not be natural or readable in the target text, in the target language. So the focus here is on the reproduction of formal features and source language characteristics. Do we find examples of these type of translations? Yes, we do, in literary and scholarly circles mainly. So scholarly translations, say for instance a very literal translation of Homer's Iliad or the Odyssey, canonical works like that, which are produced in ancient times, and there's a gap between the readers and the source and the readers and production of the time and place of production of the source text. And we aim at producing a translation that follows, that becomes an artifact of sorts of the source culture. Literal translations of press releases, for instance, in which we would be really careful with preserving the integrity of the source text, or literal translations of poetry or literary prose. In this case, one of the assumptions is that the source text has a certain authority, and that by following the style of the source language, the syntax of the source language, the word order of the source language, and the overall feel and tone of the source language, by importing those features into the target language in our target text, we are sort of showing some sort of respect for the authority of the source text or for the integrity of the message. So there are certain underlying assumptions to the application of this, the implementation of this strategy. Free translation. This would be the B side of the alter ego of the literal strategy. This method seeks not to transfer the full meaning or sense of the source text, but rather it attempts to maintain similar functional features and information units. So as you can see, functionality, equivalence in functionality and information is the of certain chunks or bits of segments of information in the source text would be the overall goal. Changes in medium and text genre take place. For instance, if we have a poem and we translate the poetry into prose, we are being free in terms of the textual genre, in terms of meter, in terms of rhyme and other rhetorical or formal features. So the communicative dimension features also can change, such as tone, older for newer varieties of language. We were translated, for instance, a middle-age poetry from the Spanish Middle Ages of the Renaissance. Would be, if we were to modernize the Spanish language, or Castilian, into contemporary Spanish, we would be taking liberties with the source text. There are two levels of free translation identified by Amparo Hurtado-Albir. A, or first, the adaptation, and B, a new version. The second, the new version, involves a greater departure from the source text through elimination of scenes, characters, etc. Examples of this implementation could be, for instance, the free adaptation of a novel. As you can see, the limits between translation and adaptation are blurred in this third transition strategy proposal. If we take the Quixote and we take the 2 volumes and come up with an adaptation for children, we're taking so many liberties with the source text in terms of length, in terms of style, in terms of dialect or variety of the language, in terms of style, tone, etc. Or maybe the Lord of the Rings for children. These free translations need to be, obviously, if we were to implement this strategy, the safest in a professional environment. We would have to play safe and agree these changes with the publisher or the initiator or sender of the translation. And finally, we have the annotated translation. Annotated translation, these translations are used in academic environments all the time. This method involves the creation of scholarly editions of certain works that could be monolingual or bilingual, and they are often accompanied or supplemented by extensive translators' footnotes. The sources become subject to historical, linguistic, and philological analysis in addition to translation, and translation becomes just a way, an additional way of for readers to access the source text. But we know that this is a translation. We know that this is an offer of information from a different time, a different culture, a different language that has been made available for us for deep study and criticism. Examples would be translations of Latin or Greek literary, philosophical, poetic works or literary works for the benefit of academic instruction. So it's always interesting to see, and as I noted earlier on, that these 4 translation procedures are just suggested as examples by Amparo Hurtado-Albir in her book of potential translation strategies available to the translator, but that, as we have been emphasizing in this course, ideally these decisions regarding potential strategies would be taken against the backdrop of a scopus, a translation brief, and a source text analysis, and that we would be taking this decisions or adopting transition strategies that would best suit the scopus and the translation brief. Although, in other words, we would be implementing a strategy that would allow us to come up with a functionally adequate translation, a translation that meets the scopus and that fulfills the translation brief. And these elements govern the translation process, from the decision making having to do with the strategy to the transition process as such, the 3 phases proposed by or put forward by Anthony Pimp: translation problem identification, generation of alternative solutions, and selection of a solution. This way, we can see that in order to fulfill a certain scopus, we may have to choose any of the 4 strategies: communicative, interpretative, free, literal, or even an annotated translation. The choice of strategy will be a function entirely of the scopus that we have, the intended purpose of the intended use of the target text amongst translation readers or translation receivers. Let's have a look now, after our brief discussion of translation strategies, let's shift to move on towards the second component or the second broad notion of translation procedure, or translation method, or translation technique. There are many, obviously in the literature we find different classifications, but perhaps in the field the most popular one came to us from 2 Canadian linguists called Vinay and Dalbernet. Vinay and Burnett, the history, so the story goes, were traveling back from a conference in New York, back to the home country in Canada, and they were, I suppose, as they drive, they decided to start, maybe to pass the time, they started to make a note of the text found in traffic signs on US soil, and then they compared the text of the language found on Canadian soil, on the bilingual traffic signs in Canada. This was the seed of a book that would be mainly one of those comparative manuals between the English and French, but that would become a classic for translation theory and translation theorists. It's difficult to find a manual or an introduction to the field that does not include Vinay and Albernet's, even if it's for criticism purposes. They all include references to Vinay and Albernet's catalog of translation procedures. In this book, published in 1958, entitled Stylistique comparée du français et de l'anglais, Vinay and Albernett include some proposals for translation. In addition to contrasting language and French, they look at the subject of translation, and they provide a model or a catalog of translation, both translation strategies and translation procedures that would be more congruent with each of the two strategic proposals. So first of all, we have to remember that they use their own terminology, so it can be confusing. So they talk about direct translation, and this direct translation, I'm following Jeremy Monday here, I'm quoting him at length for clarity. This first strategy, or direct translation, will be equivalent to our understanding of literal or word-for-word translation. Perhaps not as pronounced or as literal as Amparo Hurtado-Albir's literal translation that we just reviewed, but it would be a word-for-word translation. We try to translate word for word. We adhere to the source language word order and as much as we can. So formal and semantic literality, and that would be naturally the first option available to the translator. You would try to, according to Vinay and Burnett, according to their model, you would try to translate directly or literally if you can. In this direct translation, they single out the following procedures or techniques. First, borrowing. Second, calque, and then, quite confused in a way that confuses the reader, they talk about literal translation. Yes, they call one of the procedures literal translation, as opposed to the direct translation. Direct translation is translated in everyday terms would be our equivalent to literal translation. But for Vinay and Burnett, literal translation as such is one of the procedures within the first strategic proposal, or direct, or option, or alternative, that they term direct translation, to make things a little bit more complicated. If direct translation doesn't work, because languages are not as close to one another, or it is really difficult to come up with something intelligible or readable in the target language, basically if direct translation fails, we would move to what they call oblique translation, which would be closer to what we call free translation, but not Hurtado-Albir's free translation. We are not talking about an adaptation. We are talking about translation that would depart a little bit more from the source text in order to cater for the requirements of the target language. You see, so this oblique translation would include a few additional procedures for Vinay and Arbel-Net. One of them is transposition. Modulation would be another one. And equivalence, and I've kept, following Jeremy Monday, we've kept the French to distinguish equivalence in Vinay and Arbel-Net's model to the central topic of equivalence in translation. When we talk about equivalence, we're talking about a translation procedure for Vinay and Arbel-Net. We'll see what it involves in a second. And finally, adaptation. So as you can see, we have within direct translation, we have borrowing, calc, and literal translation as procedures within that strategy. And then if those don't work, we would choose the oblique translation strategy. And in typical of this strategy, we would see the translator implementing the following procedures: transposition, modulation, equivalence, and adaptation. In Vinay and Arbel-Net's model, and this varies from author to author, we have supplementary procedures, or as PM calls them, prosodic effects, results of applying the other procedures: amplification and economy, false friend, explicitation, compensation, and generalization. So let's have a look at each one with some examples. I think that those would be useful. So remember, direct translation was the first option as far as strategy is concerned for Vinay and Arbel-Net. The translator will attempt to translate word for word to see if it works. This would probably work for languages that belong to the same language, to similar or to the same language family, or in close proximity to one another in terms of culture and so on and so forth. So the first procedure in the direct translation strategy would be loan or borrowing. In this case, what we do is that the translator would take a word of expression in a language and import it into the target language to fill a gap or a vacuum in the target language, or just because that's what is being decided to do. So these borrowings can be pure with no changes, or can be, so to speak, naturalized or adapted to target language conventions, spelling, pronunciation, and so on and so forth. We have, every language has loans or borrowings. Lobby, football, you can see football is being naturalized with an accent and with changes in spelling. Meeting, which is an interesting thing, because we take meeting and some of them do have changes in meaning. In Spanish, at least in Castilian, a meeting is not only a meeting as such, it's a party political meeting. So it's a political rally. So as we can see, a meeting is a borrowing from another language. It's a naturalized borrowing, and in addition to that, it has changed or modified the meaning. Leader, goal, etc. So these are loans or borrowings. Then we have calcs. Remember, we're still in the territory of the direct translation strategy for Vinay and Arbel-Net. Calcs involve literal morphosyntactic translations of a syntagmatic structure in the source language. So several words or linguistic structures can be calqued into another language. So we have typically more than one word involved in the procedure. A hot dog, perrito caliente. Perrito caliente would be a calque of hot dog. Calque is we have this word from the French, or similar to the French word as well in Spanish, un calco. And this reminds me of when we used to take images or pictures, and we would place them on the window pane, so that the light would go through, and then we can actually follow the outline more accurately if we placed a blank sheet of paper on top of the image or the picture or drawing that we want to calc. So we are drawing following the outline. Something similar is what's going on here. We are taking structure in the source language and the source text, and we follow the outline in the target language. Literal translation. Literal translation, again, remember, this is not a procedure for Vinay and Arbel-Net, a strategy for Vinay and Arbel-Net. The name for literal translation, as we understand it in general, is direct translation. So for them, literal translation, and it's quite misleading, the use that they make of this word, is the third translation procedure in the direct translation strategy. This is word-for-word translation. So we try to follow the source language and the source text as much as we can, both culturally and linguistically. So as you can see in the example, I left my spectacles on the table downstairs can be easily translated into French. Je laissais mes lunettes sur la table en bas. As you can see, we follow the subject, verb, pronoun, noun, preposition, article, noun, and complementary adverbial structures to the letter. We follow them word for word with the same order. So when we try to apply these procedures, and we try to translate word for word, languages that may depart from one another culturally and linguistically quite a bit might not be suitable for this strategy. So Vinay and Burnett in this case argue that we may have to apply different strategies as translators. And we can see that in marked language, culturally and linguistically marked language, like proverbs, they are as like as two peas, se parecen como dos guisantes, that literal translation would not have the same equivalent effect in the target readers. She is reading, ella está leyendo. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, especially depending on what type of text or language of segments we're translating, the type of text, the type of language pairs. So if it's not possible, Vinay and Burnett allow for the implementation of oblique translation, a freer translation approach. Within this approach, they list a few famous procedures. The first one of which being transposition. Transposition involves a change in part of speech. So we are tampering with the grammar. In the source text, we had a noun. We translate in the target language in the target text. We replace that noun for a verb. So as you can see, we are always doing this as we translate. Most of the time, unbeknownst to us, we are implementing transpositions. These transpositions can be obligatory or optional. When it comes to obligatory transpositions, these are dictated by the very nature of the languages as such, as we are reminded by Vinay and Burnett. They could be optional when the translator has a range of valid options in the target language. So, according to quote Vinay and Burnett, probably the most common structural change undertaken by translators is transposition. Verb replaced by a noun. They have pioneered. Imagine that we have in the source text, they have pioneered, han sido los primeros. As you can see, we are changing, in this case, we have the verb to pioneer, and we've changed that for the first, los primeros, with una nominalización. Or we can have an adverb, and we change the adverb for a verb. He will soon be back. Se dará prisa para volver, o para regresar. As you can see, in this case, we are reformulating or translating intra these examples. We are constantly changing the structures of the grammatical aspects of the source text when we reformulate the meaning into the target language, in the target text. So we are transposing most of the time. These obligatory transpositions remind me, for instance, of every language has rules. Every language has grammatical rules. So, for instance, if we have sometimes we need to modify the part of speech because we are required to do so by the language. So this is transposition. Then we have a more semantically driven procedure called modulation. Modulation involves the change in semantic point of view of the source language or source text. Vinay and Burnett refer to it as the touchstone of a good translator, meaning that when, although a literal or even transposed translation results in a grammatically correct utterance, it is considered unsuitable, unidiomatic, or awkward in the target language. This is the moment where translators can be a little bit creative. Even if a literal translation is grammatically correct, we may feel that it is not suitable, that it becomes unidiomatic or read in an awkward way in the target language. In this case, Binet and Davernet talk about modulation or a change in the point of view of meaning of the source text. Examples of modulation would be, for instance, and I'm following Jeremy Monday's examples here, abstract for concrete or particular for general. She can do no other. She cannot act differently. As you see, we are saying the same thing, but changing the point of view slightly. Sometimes modulation can also involve, most of the time in fact, transposition. Give us a pint of her blood, give a little blood. Explicative or effect versus cause. You're quite a stranger. Or we could say, we don't see you anymore. As you can see, we have a change of point of view in these two segments. So we have modulation. Or we can take the whole for the part or the part for the whole. He shut the door in my face, or like we say in Spanish, me cerró la puerta en las narices. So we're taking the whole face and we're focusing on the nose, which is more idiomatic in the target text. Part for another part. He cleared his throat, he cleared his voice. Reversal of terms. You can have it, I'll give it to you. See, another change of point of view. We're saying the same thing with a slight change in point of view. Negation of opposite. It does not seem unusual. It's very normal. See, we are just reversing the terms here in terms of negation of opposites. Active or passive. We are not allowed to access, they do not allow us to access. As you can see, these changes sometimes modify other aspects of analysis, of discourse analysis or discursive components of the text. So it is not free, or it is not neutral or consequence free to modify the point of view of the target language, of the source text, in terms of changing the semantic point of view. But as I say, it's very normal within a freer approach to translation, in which we take a few liberties. Rethinking of intervals and limits in space and time. No parking between signs. Limit of parking. So as you can see, we have several changes that can become creative changes in point of view, and we call, and Binet and Davernet call this modulations. Then we have correspondence, as it is called in certain, to avoid the equivalence, coincidence, and equivalence, as we mentioned earlier. We find a known or familiar term as used in the target text, and we replace it with a coin equivalent. And this is very typical and very restrictive to the use of marked language, like for instance proverbs in the source language. We take a proverb in the source language and we replace it with a functionally equivalent or a natural equivalent proverb in the target language. They are as like as two peas, se parecen como dos gotas de agua y no como dos guisantes. It's raining cats and dogs, llueve a cántaros. So in this case, these are examples of equivalence or correspondence. We're finding an equivalent, functionally equivalent, and natural equivalent proverb in the target, or idiom in the target language. Very used. This correspondence or equivalence procedure appears to be limited as or very restricted in Binet and Davernet's usage to the translation of idioms and proverbs. And finally, I think we have the adaptation. We find cultural units that might be familiar for the source language readers, and we replace them with cultural units familiar to the target readers. So whenever we can, and this is allowed, a reference to baseball can be changed to football for Latin American readers, for example. So this is adaptation, the change or replacement of cultural units for more familiar cultural units in the for the target readership. Note the movement or shift as we go down the list of procedures provided by Vinaya Dalbelnet from the source culture to the target culture. We start with alone, we are in the source culture, we are we are borrowing or loaning words from the source text. Then we can calc, literal translation, transposition, we tamper with the grammar, we tamper with the point of view semantically speaking, modulation. Then we find equivalence or correspondence for idioms or marked language like proverbs, and then we adapt cultural units. As Pim identifies in this case, we see a shift as we depart from number one or from the top of the list towards the bottom of the list, from loan towards adaptation. We are moving away from the source culture and we moved into the target culture as we translate in familiar terms for the readers. So there's a progressive departure in terms of cultural boundaries as we implement one procedure and then the next and then the next in the two translation strategies. Just very quickly, we should mention the resulting effects of supplementary procedures as they are called, depending on the author. Remember, we refer to them as false friend, explicitation, compensation, amplification, and economy. So false friends may be or may not be acceptable in the target language. So they're structurally similar terms with different meanings. Librería is a bookstore, not the library. This appears to be mainly negative in most language learning environments, and learners of the language are told to avoid them. But sometimes they can be accepted in certain translation strategies. Silicon, silicio, not silicona. So Silicon Valley is not el Valle de la Silicona en español, sino el Valle del Silicio. Burro, in Italian, means butter, mantequilla, not the animal. So sometimes we may opt for false friends, but I will say that in most translation environments and most language learning environments, false friends are seen and perceived as lack of mastery of the source text. Then we have explicitation. Explicitation is a very common translation feature and has been researched quite a bit. Explicitation involves the making of information that is general or made implicit in the source text is made explicit in the target text. So it's taken to the surface or emphasized or foregrounded in the target text. We have different levels of explicitation. For instance, the grammatical level. If we see a reference to a doctor with no pictures or no supporting evidence, how do we translate that? Doctora or doctor? Because we have the gender marks in Spanish. So if we were to translate doctor as doctora, we are obviously making the source text explicit for the target readers. There's a cultural level of explicitation. Thanksgiving, Boxing Day, if we take those terms and we explain them as cultural entities in the target text, we not only translate Thanksgiving as Acción de Gracias, but we can explain what it is in a translation. That's explicitation. The pragmatic level, we take idioms and we explain them, and we make them more explicit or clearer in the target text. Non-obligatory specification has been identified as a feature of translated language, meaning, and here we're still following Jeremy Monday, that translation researchers have studied large collections of texts, of translated texts, and they've compared this translated text to non-translated text or original writing, and they've come up with a pattern of explicitation in translated language, meaning that translated texts tend to be more explicit, more concrete than their equivalents or translation, non-translated language in general. Compensation. This has to be used with caution, and sometimes it's difficult to implement, to make use of this procedure effectively. But if in translating in the overall economy of a certain translation unit, if we take as a translation unit a novel or an episode in a certain TV show, a translator may feel that there was a sacrifice or a necessary loss in terms of humor, in terms of dramatism, drama, or in any way in one part or specific point of that unit, and the translator may find another passage or another dialogue or another part of that work under translation or being translated where the loss can be compensated by making changes. And we find this tampering with the overall tenor, to use Pim's term, of a source text to maintain the overall effect at the macrotextual level in the target text by balancing content and meaning at different locations. So if there was a joke or a pun in a certain scene of that episode or in a novel, in a certain chapter in a novel, and we find a place, a location in the novel later on where we can actually incorporate that pun effectively, then we can do that to try to compensate the loss. But as I say, this is sometimes difficult to perceive by the reader and individuals who are actually consuming or using these products. So it has to be used with caution. Amplification. We do this all the time. Information not made explicit in the source text may be included in the target text. Like we may add information, explanations, paraphrasing, circumlocution, translator footnotes, depending on the translation strategy that we're following. La comunidad magrebí celebró el Ramadán. We may amplify the source text and add information concerning what the Ramadan is, or el mes de ayuno de los musulmanes. Or this amplification may not be cultural, it may be linguistic. No way translated as de ninguna de las maneras. As you can see, more words instead of shorter combinations that could be used in the target language. Linguistic economy related to amplification, but in this case, to the contrary, or contrasting with it. Linguistic elements are summarized and shortened. So more words or more short or longer segments or structures are used in the source text. We shorten those, summarize those in the target language. Yes, so what could be translated as E, very simple question with one word, instead of other longer options that could match the word length of the source text. So there's linguistic economy. So let's have a look at certain examples and see if you can remember the procedures that we have discussed. Okay, so I hope you took a few notes of the procedures. Hopefully you will be able to remember or identify these procedures in Binet and Arbelnet's classification in the following sentence or bilingual segments. So the first one I have here is, we will take the top segment of the source text. In English, we see the following text, designed for science fiction with lots of special effects, concebido para películas de ciencia ficción con muchos efectos especiales. So stop the recording and see if you can find one or more of Binet and Arbelnet's procedures for translation. Yes, in this case we see designed and then we see concebido. We can see a slight change of meaning or semantic point of view, modulation in fact, when we have designed and then conception. We're looking at, we have a slight change of transformation in terms of the meaning. And then we have obviously ciencia ficción. That's a typical example of a calque. We have science fiction to words, ciencia ficción, calque. And then we have, as you can see, we have from 0 to películas. We have added películas in the target language, and this was not included in the source text. So we have an amplification here. So we could argue that we have a small modulation, we have a calque, and we have an amplification in this translation segment. Let's have another one and see what you can identify. How to stay focused when the winds of life blow. Cómo mantenernos centrados durante las tormentas de la vida. Once again, stop the recording and see what list you can come up with in terms of procedures implemented here. Yes, I suggest the following. We have when and then we have durante. So in this case we have both a modulation and a transposition. We have a point of view because when implies a moment in time and durante implies duration. So we have a change in point of view from the point of view of modulation, and we also have changes in terms of parts of speech. Then we also have winds of life and tormentas. Again, we have a modulation. We have winds and then we have tormentas. We can also argue that we simply have a change in meaning. The winds of life and tormentas have different meanings. We can also look at, perhaps you may have said that maybe we have explicitation in this case, or the truth is that we have a modulation because it could be a modulation, one of those parts for the whole, because tormentas includes winds, but we have gone from winds, which is a specific meteorological phenomenon, and then we have gone to a more general term, which is tormentas. So we have one of those modulations in which we have the part and then the whole. Good. I think we have another one. In this case, it is from Portuguese, but I think it's easy to read and understand. Let's see what you come up with. Stop the recording for a minute and try to identify transition procedures here as well. Yes, we have proverbs like father, like son, filho de peixe sabe nadar. So we have an equivalence or correspondence. We've taken as marked language a procedure, a proverb rather, in the source language, and we have replaced it with a natural equivalent, functional equivalent in the target text. We have another segment pair. In this case, we have se ofrece a los menores que viajen en clase business, dibujos animados, juegos de sociedad, futbolín y mucho más. Then we've got the translation. Younger business class passengers will enjoy cartoons, board games, football, table soccer, and more. Stop the recording and identify procedures in this target source language and target language pair. Yes, some proposals. Se ofrece a los menores, young business class passengers. We seem to have a transposition in this case. We have a se ofrece, and then which is an impersonal use of the se pronoun and the verb ofrecer. And then we talk about looking about menores in this case. And we have menores and then que viajen en clase business. So we have an adjectival or relative pronoun with an adjectival clause, or an adjective clause. So we have a change of part of speech, a transposition. Juegos de sociedad, board games. We may have we can argue that we have a modulation because we are maybe taking juegos de sociedad and we look at a specific type of game. Or you may have surmised that what we have here is just an unexplained change in meaning. Maybe not a change in point of view, but a complete meaning shift. And then we have futbolín, football, table soccer. As you can see, futbolín is not explained in the source language, but in the target language, football has been explained. So we have an explicitation. Although it's not included here, this explicitation has also included an amplification because we've added 2 additional words to the target language. Keep out, acceso prohibido, should be an additional C there. Stop and see what we have in terms of transition procedures in this very brief segment. Yes, keep out, acceso prohibido, we have a modulation and a transposition, which is often the case. Keep out an imperative form of the verb. We have a verbal structure with the instruction not to stay outside, whereas in the translation we have a noun structure with a past participle, prohibido. So there's a change of part of speech, and in addition to that we have a change in point of view. We are saying the same thing but with a change in stay outside, and the access to this place is forbidden. So we have a typical case of modulation and transposition, changing semantic point of view. More examples. 3 years since his last stretch run at this venue, there was a familiar sense of reassurance as Clapton, now age 64, strolled on. Translated as 3 años después de su última actuación en el auditorio londinense, Eric Clapton, quien ahora cuenta 64 años, salió con paso tranquilo al escenario. Again, stop the recording and let's see what list of procedures you come up with. Good, we have a few things in this dense segment. 3 years since, 3 years after, 3 años después. So in this case we are changing the point of view a little bit. It's one thing to say 3 años desde, 3 años después. So we have a modulation there, we could argue. Then we have the term venue, which is a general term, but which also has the meaning in it, embedded, so to speak, of a place where an artistic musical performance takes place. But in Spanish we have auditorio londinense. We have made venue, which is a more general term, we've made it more explicit or specific in Spanish with auditorio londinense. Not only adding, but also amplified the source text with the addition of londinense. So we have an explicitation and an amplification. Now aged, quien ahora cuenta. So we have a transposition as well. As you can see, we have different parts of speech being used. We also have strolled on, salió con paso tranquilo al escenario. See this beautiful example of how many nuances and elements, semantic elements, can be included in a single verb in one language, in the target language, in the source language, in the English segment, with strolled on, with the preposition there. And in Spanish, if we want to, the translator decided to amplify, roll out the components of strolled in a much longer and explicit or specific segment or translation or rendering. Salió con paso tranquilo al escenario, just for strolled on. So we have an amplification and we have a clear case of explicitation in these segments. We have another one here. Remove the cleaner from the water at the shallow end of the pool by pulling the cable until the cleaner reaches the surface, which has been rendered as saque la limpiadora del agua por la parte de menor profundidad de la piscina tirando del cable hasta que la limpiadora alcance la superficie. Stop the recording and identify procedures. Okay, we have remove and saque. We have changes, semantic changes, obviously. Remove, do this. This is an imperative. We also have saque, imperative. So in this case, we have the same parts of speech. There's an element of extraction in the target text, and there's an element of also extraction, but also removal, which is separation, which is could be construed as a modulation or a change of point of view from a point of view of meaning. Then we have at the, por la. So we have in this case also a slight change in meaning by pulling, tirando. So by doing this, tirando, in this case we can see a transposition. We have a preposition and an ing form by pulling, whereas in the Spanish, tirando, the gerund, includes this element of how to or manner in the source language, and this is beautifully transferred with this slight change of part of speech or structural change. We have the shallow end, la parte de menor profundidad, where we have a change in point of view, the shallow end, la parte de menor profundidad, and then amplification with more words added. And you can argue that we can have that the result is also more explicit or specific. So we could have an explicitation here as well, which typically could be argued to accompany or to go by hand in hand with amplification when it occurs. Another one, perhaps his stage clothes had been mislaid in a last-minute rush to get to the gig. Quizás se había extraviado su vestuario con las prisas de última hora por llegar al auditorio. Same exercise, list the procedures implemented here. Yes, we have stage clothes, vestuario, in which we have a generalization. Stage clothes is more specific. Vestuario seems to be more general. Has been mislaid, or had been mislaid rather, se había extraviado. We see a change in meaning. Mislaid implies perhaps carelessness. Haber extraviado also includes carelessness, but one thing is to mislaid, to place in a spot which was not the expected one, and extraviado is to have lost completely. So we have in this case, it couldn't even be a modulation. It could be just a complete meaning shift that the translator will have to explain. Then we have the last-minute rush, las prisas de última hora. We can argue that this is an equivalent, a correspondence in terms of translating a certain idiomatic expression. Last-minute rush, prisas de última hora. We also have, although it's not included there, note that we have. Perhaps it can be argued, or maybe you suggested a transposition here as well, or a modulation, because you have the last minute. Although in Spanish we have a typical idiom is última hora, not el último minuto. So we have a change from a part to the overall, from minute to hour. So it could be a modulation as well. And then we have the gig and the auditorio. We have a clear modulation in which we have changed the point of view. Instead of referring to the concert or the gig, we've changed that to the place where the location where the gig is going to take place. So we have a modulation there as well. Excellent. We have some selected references, and I hope this unit has been enlightening to show that it is useful for the translator to be able to label, to name what we do when we translate. So instead of saying I've done this, I've done that, it is I think useful for you as trainees or as translators to acquire, get in the habit of using the acquired taxonomies or terminology that you have acquired in this unit, so that you are able to say, well, in this segment I've implemented a modulation and a transposition because they were procedures more suitable for my chosen translation strategy, which is so and so. So in this case, we would be able to explain to customers, to clients, to project managers, to reviewers or revisers or proofreaders, or to anyone criticizing our translations. We would be able, in this case, to provide some technical terms and describe our translation procedures in technical terms, to provide to add a little bit of objectivity and to our description of what we do when we justify our translation decisions in a way that it's more professional. So I feel that it is useful for you to acquire this knowledge and try to train yourselves to be aware of when and how you make use of these procedures in your translation work, and be able to train your eye to label them and to name them correctly when describing your work for third parties or for fellow translators. Thank you for your time and in this unit, and we've come to the end of this video lecture. Thank you.